Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the CQC Public Board meeting here in Bristol. Welcome to Bristol. We have apologies from Jora Gill and John Oldham and Liz Sace. Otherwise I think we're all here. I want to particularly welcome this morning Rina Rabidia, who is the co-chair of the CQC's Race Equality Network. You're very welcome, and please feel free to speak as if you were a member of the board throughout this session. Does anybody have any declaration of interest they need to make? Excellent. That takes us to the minutes of the meeting of the 15th of May. Are they a true and accurate record of everything we discussed? Thank you very much. So they are approved. We have 3 items on our action log. The first one is completed, so thank you for that. The written response has been sent. The second one, again, is due for today, but actually not quite ready to provide the information, so that will come back to the next meeting. And then the third item, again, was a written answer to a question that was raised at the last public session, and that has been sent. So is there anything else arising from the minutes that anybody wants to raise? Okay, so we then move on to the first substantive item of the agenda, which is Walton Hall. And before I hand over to Ian, can I just say that I think that anybody and everybody that watched the Panorama programme would have been absolutely horrified by what we saw. And I personally, and I know colleagues as well, very much regret the fact that those who were seen to be abusing very vulnerable patients were able to conceal their activities from our inspectors, and indeed from all the other professionals that visited Walton Hall over quite an extended period of time. It's a matter of huge regret, and my thoughts have been very much with the victims and their families. My thoughts have also been with our staff who were involved, because I know that they are all deeply upset by what happened. So really, really regrettable set of circumstances, to put it at its mildest. With that, Ian, can I pass over to you, please?
Thanks, Peter. I think I'd like to join you in that apology that we've made publicly, but also on a personal level. I think it is a source of much regret. I think I've spoken to a number of colleagues over the last few weeks about Walton Hall, and I think what comes through again and again in those conversations is that we all joined the Care Quality Commission to keep people safe in a range of health and social care settings, and it was clear that we failed to do so on this occasion, and that's a source of deep regret and a source of deep anger, I think, but it is driving a determination to understand exactly what happened and to make sure that we change as an organisation, and that we make sure that we minimise the chance of this happening in future. The Panorama programme appeared to show a member of staff at Walton Hall committing criminal offences and deliberately trying to thwart our inspection methods. I am choosing my words carefully here. I'm using the word appeared because this is a live police investigation. And I don't want to say or do anything which compromises the police's ability to secure a prosecution, and I'm sure you join me in that sentiment. I do recognise that causes a degree of frustration in some quarters, that we have been fairly circumspect in some of the public statements that we've made, and I know that is causing frustration, but I don't apologise for that, because I think it's vital that we can we can work with the police to secure a prosecution here. Reflecting on this as a whole, I think my headline is that I think what needs to happen now is a package of measures need to be put in place that are delivered by a range of partners. Although we've been quite forthright in terms of what we think needs to happen and what we can do, I know that other partners are starting to reflect on what they can do, and that's been less clear in the public mind. I think effective regulation, as I've said on a couple of occasions before, relies on an alliance of partners. Commissioners, patients, advocates, providers, and ourselves working together. If all of those people work together and work effectively, then there is an opportunity for really effective regulation. It is just simply not possible to inspect institutions and then understand exactly what is going on. So this is very much about bringing that alliance of people together, and that's what we hope to be doing in the coming weeks and months. In terms of what we're specifically doing at the moment, I see it as three phases: past, present, and future. We're looking specifically at the allegations that were made by our former colleague Barry Stanley Wilkinson, who alleged that his report that he wrote in 2015 after an inspection was in some ways suppressed. We have asked David Noble, a respected retired former senior lawyer, to look at that on our behalf, to run an independent review into exactly what happened in 2015 going into 2016. And the reason we're doing that is because we know that's an issue which we want to get looked at fairly quickly, but it's something that we think can be reported on in a matter of weeks rather than months. We also then want to look more broadly about the way in which we've regulated services from 2015 to 2019 at Walton Hall, and consider how the lessons from Walton Hall can be extended more broadly into regulation in these closed settings. And I'm pleased to announce today that Professor Glynis Murphy, who's the Professor of Clinical Psychology and Disability at the University of Kent, has agreed to lead that independent review into our work. And we'll be formally announcing that in public after the board meeting, along with terms of reference. So 2 independent reviews, one to look specifically at a set of circumstances, and one to look more broadly at our regulatory history. I think in all the talk of Walton Hall, though, I think another important review has had relatively little coverage, which is the review that Dr. Paul Elliott, our colleague, did on restraint, seclusion, and segregation. And that made some important recommendations around how the system should work with people who had, particularly with autism. And his recommendation was that a new model of care needs to emerge, and we need to be part of a group of people looking at creating that new model of care. And we need to think about that model of care in the context of a model of care that is probably easier to regulate than the current model of care. It is also worth underlining, though, that although there are 2 reviews, and I'm reluctant to rush to judgment in terms of what those reviews may take place, it is very important that they are genuinely independent. None of that stops us from acting in the short term. So there's a number of operational changes that we've already made, and we will continue to make over weeks and months. Some of that will be around the methodology that we use, but some of it will also be about enforcement activity that's going on. Please be assured there's a significant amount of inspection and enforcement activity going on, much of which we can't currently talk about publicly because it's still in process. But as soon as we're able to talk about individual cases, then we will do so publicly. And so we will be revisiting our practice on a continuous basis. And as things emerge from these reviews, if there's an obvious change to make, then we will absolutely make it. So I'm going to pause there, Peter, and just ask Ted and then Chris to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Peter. Can I just reiterate what you've just said about how appalled we were by what we saw in the Panorama programme? And I speak for myself and deep regret that we failed to pick up what was going on there, but also on behalf of all my colleagues. And it is important to stress that the people working in the CQC, my colleagues, are very driven by their purpose to prevent harm to patients and service users. And when we fail to do so, we feel it deeply, and we're determined to learn lessons. We know we must do better. As Ian has highlighted, we've already made some changes, and we will continue to do so, learning lessons from the immediate events, but also we've stepped up our inspection activity, we've reassessed risk in similar services, we have taken enforcement action, and as and when we can talk about that, we will, because I think important lessons are still to be learnt on this. We, of course, will learn from the independent reviews, and they are very important for us to learn from the best expertise out there about how we can improve our inspection methodology so we can be much more likely to pick up this kind of abuse. Our inspections will never be perfect, but we know they can be better, and we must do everything possible to make them as good as possible. I'll just come back to the thematic review on restraint, seclusion, segregation. I was deeply shocked when I read it, as I know other members of the board were. It is deeply disappointing that the whole system, including us, have failed to move forward the model of care for these very vulnerable patients, failed to learn lessons effectively from Winterbourne Review and move things forward. We must redouble our efforts to lead on that. We can't do it alone, but we must lead on it. We must see this process forward. And I think that's something I strongly take away from this.
Thanks, Ted. Chris.
Just to build on what Ted was saying, since the Panorama documentary, we've been in contact with a number of whistleblowers, and one of the things that is interesting in that is talking to them about the support that we can receive, and also the way in which we can help them to tell their story more, so we can learn from it. And I think there's work that we can do and should do in that regard. The other thing that we set up as part of Dr. Paul Elliott's review, we set up an advisory group of a group of people who've got lived experience of these services, and they were collectively talking about the important role that advocates play in understanding how these services operate, if you like, between inspections all the time. And I think there's something about the nature of advocacy, making sure that they are genuine advocates, people who have and build relationships with people who use services, and that we can have ongoing conversations with them. I think there's more we can do with regards to that. So alongside the work of the independent reviews, I think there's work that we'll begin to do ourselves in trying to understand some of the how we can take forward some of those actions early. But I think there's a desire from the groups that represent the advisory group and from other public organisations that we, to Ted's point, we need to move into how do we move away from this model of care, because it's toxic for the individuals. It provides an environment that's very closed and difficult to intervene, and it doesn't provide the right services for people. So I think it's important that we collectively, with the pressure we put on other parts of the system, move away from this model of care.
Good, thanks, Chris. Can I open it up to the board? Lewis.
Well, thank you very much. Independent review is very important. There is always a sense outside, I think, that when we point to independent reviews, and they're going to pick up a lot of the issues, there's a sort of suspicion, I suppose, that we are slightly ducking the discussion that needs to take place. And I think I just want to be certain from today that we'll be taking straight away whatever action we can, having the discussions we need to have, and perhaps not just in the field of learning disability care, but in related areas, because some of the same issues apply to the care of people with dementia. They apply to care of children. And I want to make sure that we've said that clearly, that there are certain things that we don't need a review to do. And if I can give you a couple of examples. The first, at the core of Walton Hall, it seems to me, is how we respond to allegations of abuse that are made by people who, perhaps because of learning disability, at least in this case, find it difficult to articulate clearly what happened, or find it difficult to be consistent. And for that reason, sometimes don't meet the standards of evidence that we might in the rest of our work require. And it's worthwhile people understanding that CQC gets a lot of challenges to the evidence that it puts forward about in inspections, and they come from the providers. And so we have to be quite robust about the evidence that we put forward. But you just wonder, looking at what happened, whether the robustness that we require has to be tempered with an understanding of who is providing this evidence at times. And when it's somebody with learning disability, we should be now reviewing how we respond to people with learning disability, the kind of credibility that we lend to their account, even if it doesn't, even if it changes from time to time, or isn't endorsed by what other people tell us. So one person telling us that they've been abused should be enough for us to be concerned. I don't know in what circumstances somebody with learning disability might say they had been abused if they hadn't. I dare say it could happen, but I don't know in what circumstances it would happen. And I think that's the starting point that we should have when we inspect. So listening to what people have got to say and looking for the signs, the institutional signs, that all is not right with this place. The rapid turnover of staff, the use of agency staff, the use of non-qualified staff, high sickness absence rates, all the things that, from an institutional point of view, are indicators that there is something amiss in the environment. So that we can move away from the sense that we're dealing with deception by staff, which we will always find it difficult to get around, but actually dealing with something which we can understand in a better way. Both the testimony of the residents themselves and the institutional factors which might signal something to us that we should take more seriously. So there's one area that we could say now that we will do something about. I think a second one for me is on the issue of how we use CCTV and technology to monitor what happens. And I accept the limitations of that. I do. One of the more chilling parts of the programme was when staff were talking about how they might get round the use of CCTV. But it's possible that we've been rather cautious in our previous considerations of this issue. And the balance that we've tried to strike between safety and the use of CCTV and related technologies and some of the human rights issues that we've been concerned about, the capacity and confidentiality concerns, that we might need to rethink whether we've got that balance in the right place now. And then the third thing is the one that Ted and Chris both referred to, which is the model of care. As you know, this is my last CQC board meeting. I came into CQC in the aftermath of Winterbourne View, and I'm leaving in the starting point of responding to Walton Hall. And I think that CQC has tried to do what it can to raise standards in what are sometimes quite closed institutions for people with learning disability. But CQC is not the only part of that system. And if we're finding that the system as a whole, in the care of learning disability residents who have what is often called complex needs, if we find the system as a whole is not responding in the right way, then we probably have to step up our response. And that might mean that we no longer register this model of care, and that we look retrospectively at places that we have registered. My personal view is that this model of care is no longer acceptable, no longer supportable. The history tells us that, and anything we do other than ending this model of care will simply lead us to the next scandal at a future point. So I know that we've started to consider that, but I think we just need to make it clear to people that these are the kind of fairly firm steps that we are now prepared to take in how we, as I say, in how we inspect and respond to people and their allegations, how we use technology to monitor, and whether we're prepared to continue registering a model of care which has failed people so clearly and so regularly. That's what I'm hoping we'll do. The other part, I think, is to regularly report on that, to bring that kind of consideration by CQC itself, not just the independent review, but by CQC itself on these kind of issues, to report publicly each time we meet, each board meeting, on what we've done about these issues.
Robert.
Well, thank you. Like everyone else, the I viewed all that programme and I've read what I've read with profound shock. And recognised in what we've seen, sadly, although it's much even more extreme, this Walton Hall is, some of the elements that I found with Staffordshire. Multiple visits by multiple agencies to an establishment, none of them apparently finding anything remotely as concerning as we now appear to know was there. So I welcome the reviews that are being put in place. And I wanted to ask two questions about those reviews. Firstly, as Lewis has said, it's extremely important that not only are they independent, but they are seen and the public are satisfied that they're independent. And therefore, I'd seek your assurance, and I'm sure you'll be happy to give it, that those conducting the reviews will have the freedom in their discretion to go wherever they think they need to go in terms of documentation, evidence, people they will want to interview both inside and outside our organisation in order to come to their conclusions. And so there are, of course, terms of reference, there always will be, but I'll ask for an assurance those terms of reference include the ability for them to, as it were, go beyond what is on the printed page if they think that's necessary. The second point, and it plays to something Lewis said, in relation to the wider review, will that review encompass a consideration of CQC's role in registering places or services where the model of care is said by us in a report not to be satisfactory? In other words, there's nothing intrinsically bad about the people running a particular place and they're doing their best and so on, but we are saying, as we've said now clearly, that a model of care is not acceptable. And therefore, what are we meant to do as a regulator in those circumstances? And the third point I'd like to make is this, that bearing in mind what we've heard about, we know already about, as I say, that lots of people visiting and not finding anything, we do need to consider what it is that people ought to be looking for when they are considering these matters. And you would probably expect me to raise this, but as Chair of Health Watch England, and therefore your representative for 152 Health Watches on the ground, I would ask that consideration is given to what assistance we could ask Health Watch to give in these circumstances. I hasten to add that as I understand it, and we have asked, local Health Watch had no knowledge of anything like this at Walton Hall, but that's partly my point, which is what is it that we can do to equip organisations such as Health Watch and indeed mental health advocates with the know-how or the perceptiveness that might make it less likely that things like this or the concerns about risk and so on go undetected. And I just put that wider point into the picture. But thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Let's pause there, Ian. Do you want to just respond to Lewis and Robert?
Thank you. A number of important points. I think I can give the assurances that both of you are asking in different ways in terms of the independent reports. They will be they are genuinely independent. I'm determined they are genuinely independent. So the chairs of those reports will have the absolute discretion to go wherever they need to go. I think it is our very clear determination that we get to the bottom of what's gone on here, and we're not going to restrict people's ambition based on terms of reference. So Robert specifically, we will flex the terms of reference if it turns out we need to. I've just specifically not announced timescales for these reviews because we want to give the chairs of the reviews the opportunity to talk to whoever they need to talk to and look at what they need to look at in order to get to the nub of the issue, rather than said this must be delivered within a narrow time frame. So that I hope gives you some assurance. I think, Lewis, you were looking for assurance around are we going to act to do things in the short term that we think just need to be done, and I can give you that categorical assurance that that's already going on. But I think you raised a number of important points around institutional risk factors. I think I think we've tended to look for evidence to take enforcement action and form judgments about the rating that we give to a location. I think we still need to do that, but I think there's an and to that, perhaps, which Walton Hall has shown us, is that where we see particularly extreme risk factors, then we need to take sort of almost intermediate action to look for more and more evidence and not leave until we have got more assurance around what's going on. And that might be assurance which stops short of us actually taking an enforcement action, if that makes sense. So I think we've already asked our intelligence team to review the Walton Hall evidence, because in many respects with other providers where we've closed them down or we've taken legal action, we've put something like 7 providers into special measures in recent times, and we've closed down 3 of them. There wasn't necessarily evidence of abuse, so we knew that they weren't well-run institutions, but we couldn't connect the risk factors to abuse. In Walton Hall, we absolutely can, and so at Walton Hall, I think it is an opportunity to look for what are the real risk factors and try and look for patterns in the data, and that's exactly the piece of work that Malta's team are doing as we speak. So I can give you an absolute assurance around that. In terms of use of CCTV and technology, I think everyone around this table knows that the use of technology is quite divisive. Some people feel very strongly that CCTV should be used very extensively. Some people have different views. I think part of this review activity must be to bring people together to start to get a consensus around that topic. And I think there is a sense that in the past, perhaps, that people's privacy has outweighed everything else. But I think in what Walton Hall shows, perhaps, is that privacy perhaps might need to be traded for safety in certain circumstances. It's not the place one would like to go, but I think it's a realistic assessment of where some places are. I think your point about there are other closed locations that carry risk, I think, is well made, and a number of colleagues have already picked up on that. I know in Kate's area, in adult social care, closed dementia floors are a concern. Actually, domiciliary care in people, particularly people with dementia living at home who are being supported on a daily basis, perhaps with no relatives, are another risky area that are quite difficult for us to get in and inspect. So again, I think we need to do that. I think the balancing factor, though, is that an awful lot of great care is delivered by people in these closed environments, and we need to try and balance the need to act assertively in a way that protects the genuinely vulnerable, but at the same time not act in a way which frankly causes widespread public concern. And so that's a difficult balance in terms of some of our public statements, which I think we'll continue to wrestle with. You also asked about regular reporting to the board. I'm very happy, Peter, if you're comfortable to make a commitment that we will report on a monthly basis, both to the public and the private board, in terms of activity that's going on. As I said earlier on, there's a range of enforcement action which we can't talk about publicly at this stage, but over the course of weeks we will be able to. But I'm very happy to commit to both enforcement action and reporting on enforcement action, as well as reporting on other operational changes we've made, just to give the board the assurance that we are acting as over and above the independent report activity. I think Robert asked a question around the registering these locations. We need to be clear that since Winterbourne View some 7 years ago, we have not registered another location of this sort. So we are not registering new locations, and at times our registration approach in these sorts of environments has come under legal challenge. But we feel that we will continue to robustly challenge the notion of these large-scale congregate settings. However, we have not acted to close places down yet. And I was very struck by Sir Stephen Bubb's report in 2014, where he talked about the commissioners and CQC working together to both create new provision, and then the CQC using registration powers and ratings powers to start to close places down over a period of time. And I've seen calls for that more recently from important voices in the voluntary sector. And I think I welcome those voices, and I welcome the interest that those groups are taking in this topic. I think we need to think about all options, frankly. I am instinctively reluctant to start to commit to closing places down before this new provision, fairly obviously, and I think everyone shares that view, particularly in a marketplace where there's extreme limits on beds, and so there isn't capacity in the market. But I do think we do need to think about what more we can do as the Commission in terms of how we lobby and how we and becoming more vocal generally. And I think that's a potential tool in our armoury. I think your point about Health Watch and other voices is an important one. I'm hoping that certainly what Professor Murphy will be able to help us with is bringing some academic rigour and helping to create some tool sets for our people and other people to use. I'm envisaging that we will be in a position where we can start to do perhaps a bit more structured interviewing, use technology in a range of different ways, which I hope Professor Murphy and others can help us with to design a set of tools and techniques and approaches which enable us to be far more incisive and deal more effectively with individuals who are seeking to thwart our regulation. Because I think in closing, these are criminal offences committed by people who are seeking to thwart conventional methodologies, and we need to be better than that. And I think that's what I'm hoping these reviews will help us with, and that's going to require a level of research and academic input which we haven't had to date. Thanks, Peter.
So, Ian, can I just clarify something you said before going to Kate? Because you said we haven't closed places down. Of course we have, but what we haven't done is close places down simply because the model of care is one that we don't think is appropriate. I think there's a distinction to be made. Yeah, just to clarify. Kate.
So if I can just give the board a bit more detail about what we're doing in the meantime to continue progressing this work. So as part of the original plan around the restraint, seclusion and segregation piece of work, there was always going to be 2 phases, and we are currently moving into phase 2, which is looking at restraint, seclusion and segregation within a broader range of settings, with a large focus on those settings within adult social care. So at the moment we have identified those homes that we will be going out to through the next couple of months. We've got a team assembled that are very experienced inspectors, along with experts by experience and pharmacists who will be going into these services. And during this period of time when we're doing these kind of focused inspections on these homes that we've identified, we will also be asking other inspectors who are going into similar sorts of services to be asking additional specific questions focused on restraint, seclusion and segregation, so that we've got a window to really get a good picture about what's going on with this agenda in other people's, in other homes that we haven't looked at yet. So that piece of work is progressing as planned, and I just wanted to respond in terms of Lewis's challenge about it's really important that we're not sitting here while these reviews take place. There is concrete work that's still going ahead as planned to move forward on this.
Thanks, Kate. So I think the independent reviews, which, just to reinforce what Ian said, are completely independent and will be as critical of us as they feel is appropriate, without going to in any way hinder them. They are really important. And then meanwhile we get on with whatever else we think we can do to improve the situation and minimise the risk of a repeat. So, good. Let's move on then to the next item, Ian, which is the executive team report, please. No, he's mumbling. He's mumbling. He doesn't want it broadcast. Right, we're getting there. We're just... Okay.
Yeah, apologies. The executive team report has a number of publications. I'll hand on to the chief inspectors and others and the other directors to talk about that shortly. This is the first time we've been using Microsoft Power BI to review performance, and non-executive directors will be given access to that shortly to enable them to do deep dives into performance in future months. What we've done is taken a static cut of those charts and tables for this month, which are attached to the annex. I think in headline terms, I think it's worth noting that our core timeline commitments, particularly around inspection and registration, have all started well this year. I think I was also pleased to see that safeguarding referral performance, which has been an area of concern in previous months, has hit 100%. Enforcement levels are similar to last year, which I think is an important point. I think sometimes in the press we're often seen to be taking more enforcement than perhaps has been the case in previous years. That's not currently the case. I was also pleased that sickness levels are broadly on track, and I think that's good in one sense. But what we're doing this year is looking at something called the Bradford factor, which is a composite measure that looks at sickness both in terms of numbers of days absent but also frequency of sickness. So therefore it gives us a much more intelligent view of sickness, and it gives us a view of why people are off sick, and that in turn talks to engagement and a whole range of other things. So I think that's excuse me, that's a useful development. And then finally, from a financial position, I think we started the year with a small overspend in the month of April. I know Chris and colleagues are working hard to get behind the detail of that, and we will be working hard to make sure that we get the budget back on track. Thanks, Peter.
Great. So where are we going next, Ian?
If we go next to...
Nobody's volunteering? It's Ted? Ted?
Yes.
Ted.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. So in terms of the publications that we've got coming out at the moment, we've already mentioned the review of restraint, seclusion and segregation, a very important report, and as colleagues have already expressed, it's very important we follow up on that report and complete the review. So that is going to be a major part of our work going forward. Today we're also publishing an update on driving improvement in independent hospitals, study from 8 independent hospitals who've improved significantly in ratings, and the themes in that are very similar to the previous driving improvement reports we've produced, that this is about leadership, culture, engagement, and building on the CQC's findings. And I think it's very encouraging that the case reports in there highlight how those individual hospitals have used the CQC's findings to drive improvement. And we've seen real improvement over the last few years in independent hospitals, and I'll be launching that at the Independent Health Providers Network tomorrow. And so that should be a really interesting day, talking to providers about how they're learning from our reports. Later on this month, we expect to publish our latest report on monitoring the Mental Health Act. This is looking at the Mental Health Act Code of Practice and what we've learned about that in the last year in the light of Simon Wesley's report on the Mental Health Act and the way forward. So an important report in context in terms of providing evidence how effective the code is being implemented at the moment. Colleagues will have seen previous reports on that where we expressed some dissatisfaction with the implementation of the code, and this is, if you like, our latest position on that. Next week we're publishing the 2018 inpatient survey results. This is the biggest survey of inpatients that takes place every year. It is a very important part of the year in assessing how patients' experience of inpatient care has changed over the last year, so that will be important next week. And we will be publishing shortly some guidance on effective staffing, looking at how services have improved the way they're using their staff more flexibly to be more productive and improve the quality of care. This is a really important part of what we're trying to do with providers, encouraging them to innovate around staffing practices in a way that is safe, but not in a way that is very rigid. I think a lot of providers sometimes take a very rigid approach to our guidance, and we want to emphasise that we are flexible in how staffing takes place, provided it is done in a considered and safe way. And so there are opportunities to learn from those people who've led on this. So those are the publications coming up in the near future.
Thanks, Ted. And Rosie.
We've got an upcoming publication, which is the Defence Medical Services Annual Report. We're in the second year of working with the Surgeon General to look at the Defence Medical Services, and the report's going to show our findings over the last year. Just to mention that we're getting very positive feedback from the Defence Medical Services about our joint work with them, and that's highlighted in the report as well. So that's being published in early July.
Thanks, Rosie. And Walter, I think, lastly with you.
Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, to make the board aware of our work following the passing of new legislation, the Mental Capacity Amendment Act 2019, which became law last month. This is a very important legislation because it describes how people in care settings can be deprived of their liberty if they're seen to not have capacity to decide for themselves. CQC over the last few years has raised issues with the previous so-called deprivation of liberty safeguards and their implementation of these rules and the challenges around them, and this legislation is going to address some of these challenges. The legislation is going to expand the rules on what is now going to be called liberty protection safeguards, including to younger people and to people in their home settings or shared living arrangements. So that has implications for CQC's duty to oversee the implementation of previously the deprivation of liberty safeguards and now the liberty protection safeguards. They're going to be implemented in October next year, 2020, and we're currently working to fully scope out the implication for CQC and make them a reality in our operational approach by October next year. Two further publications then, which we recently published. First of all, the CQC equality objectives, which were discussed at the board previously and agreed, have now been made public and continue to set out our work to ensure greater equality for people using services, alongside of other publications and work that we're doing around what good looks like for people and equality and services. And also a report on the medicines and medicines management in both health and adult social care settings, which goes across all sectors, and we're setting out a number of areas of risk of managing medicines and also good practice alongside that on how services can improve that. Thank you, Peter.
So thanks, Walter, and thanks, everybody. Any questions for any of the executive team? Great. Really good, comprehensive set of reports. Thank you very much indeed. Kirsty, change update.
This is the first update we've done this is a lot update for the last quarter. So in terms of sort of overall progress, there's been quite a lot of work we've been doing, particularly around developing our narrative, making sure that we really explain the work that we're doing around change and really explain the why and then what it means to people. And we've been doing some work particularly around building personas and sharing that with colleagues so that they can see the journey that we're going on and understand what it starts to mean for them. And I think that's been well received and we're making good progress there. We've done some work around finalising our portfolio to make sure that the programmes we have in our change portfolio are really well aligned to our strategy and really going to deliver against our business priorities moving forwards. We have now created our PMO, that's our Project Management Office, and put the resources in there and started to build the processes to support effective delivery of change through regular reporting, managing of the portfolio. We've also done some work to onboard our QI partner. They've started with us, they're a company called Oakland, and they've started with us in the last month, and we will start to work with them over the coming months to really start to build our quality improvement culture and really start to drive improvements from across the organisation in terms of our process and how we work. We've done some work around our portfolio resource strategy to ensure that we have the right people with the right skills in the right place at the right time. That is also, we recognise that we need to bring people into the organisation to help us do that, but it's also providing a really good opportunity for our colleagues within the business to either use skills that they don't currently utilise around the change space, and actually also opportunities for our people on our talent programmes to really provide a bit of stretch and challenge in that space too. I'll come on and talk about the individual programs that we have been starting to put some progress into. But I think overall we're making some really good progress now in terms of our portfolio delivery of change. We know where we are, we know what our risks are, and we know the sort of rate of progress that we're making through, which I think is quite a significant achievement given where we were a few months ago. I'll come on to talk about the people strategy when I finish my bit of the report. In terms of the work that we're doing on the individual programs, we have 36 programs within our portfolio. Those programs are, say, designed to align to our strategic intent. They're designed to make it easier for people to do their jobs day to day, easier for providers to do business with us and interact with us, and easier for the public to find out what we know and for them to tell us what they know. In terms of the work that we've been doing, we have a number of strategic programs in place. Our registration transformation program is making good progress. We are well into our initial private beta stage of the first end-to-end piece around delivering adult social care to agencies, and that's looking at registration from the start of the process right through to the end, and we're making really good progress in that space, using service design methodologies to ensure that we ask the right questions and deliver against the right area of work. We're also making some really good progress around the quality improvement elements of that, driving improvements in the work that we're doing to lean out our systems and processes so they're as efficient as they can be, and we can really start to see some really good progress there in terms of shaving time off the time it takes from an application coming in to us making a decision and notifying providers. Our future regulatory services work is looking at our model to understand what we might want to do in terms of our regulatory model in the future, really understanding what's going on out there in the landscape and what we might need to do in terms of our programme to ensure that we are able to respond to those changes well and efficiently. We have a number of projects working within that programme to look at both how we can improve our data gathering and how we can use our data to really look at helping us make informed regulatory decisions, and also looking at our operating model in the future and what that might mean to look at. And we're doing some work in discovery stage to really understand and scope out what we might want to look at in that space. Also in there is some work to look at how we can share, so how the public can share their experiences of care with us. One of our programs we have in this place is called Tell Us About Your Care. And that's a new system to make it easier for people to tell us about the experiences they've had with care. That's now in private beta, and I'm hoping that we'll get that into public beta, which means we'll actually have a live service up and running at some point in the autumn. In terms of our people, we are continuing to work on our vision and our culture to think about what that needs to be for the future in terms of what we want this organisation to look and feel like. We've started some work on that. We've got more work to do in this space, and it's very much the focus of the executive team and our leadership team moving forwards. We've also done some more work around our attraction and retention and looking at our pay structures and looking at how we can simplify those. We are hoping that we'll have our business case finalised for our pay, which will enable us to do more around simplifying those structures and making it easier to understand the structures that we currently have. We also have done some work around our well-being and workload, and we're looking at putting in some processes or we have put in some processes now as a resource oversight to help manage supply and demand across the organisation, so we can match skills with the right place in the organisation, so we can match skills with the demand and move people around much more effectively to manage both our vacancy factors and also ensure that we can get people into post quickly and effectively. Our diversity and inclusion is really core to what we're doing. We have recruited a diversity and inclusion manager. They joined CQC a few weeks ago, which has been really, really positive. We are also looking at we have now put KPIs in place for our diversity and improvement and inclusion, so we can start to report that as part of our normal KPIs, so it really becomes front and centre of what we're doing. And we've also doing some work to evaluate the success of the independent panels that we've had with us on the reporting programmes as we've moved forwards. I'm going to hand over to Mark to talk through some of the specifics around some of the digital change programmes as he has responsibility for those now.
Thanks, Kirsty. So we've got a number of initiatives in progress to transform our digital capabilities, to give our colleagues the digital tools to do their jobs, to support our vision to become intelligence-led, and to improve digital services to providers and to the public. In the short term, there are a number of projects in progress which will complete by the end of this year. This includes projects intended to ensure our colleagues have got access to the appropriate technology, and includes things like laptops, smartphones, improving broadband, office Wi-Fi, meeting room technology, etc. We also have in progress initiatives to improve the performance of our analytics capabilities and introduce new analytics and reporting tools, which will also be completed by the end of this year. Longer term, we're making really great progress in initiating a program to migrate all of our foundational IT services into a new digital service delivery model. And finally, we're formulating a business case to deliver a replacement to our core CRM technologies into more suitable alternatives. And this is a complex multi-year rolling initiative which seeks to improve those core application services to support our regulatory activity. Thanks, Kirsten.
So I get exhausted just listening to what you're all doing. But more seriously, I think just a congratulations to you, Kirsty, and your team for all that's going on. I mean, there's obviously a huge amount still to do, but it's feeling really good now, and I'd like to congratulate you. Similarly, Mark, I think, again, it feels good that we're now getting our arms around the issues as we need to, so thank you. We might also, Kirsty, you didn't mention it, but it's in your written report, the board might like to congratulate Debbie Westhead on her appointment as Director of Improvement. Debbie, of course, was a constant feature at the board for the first few months this year until Kate arrived, so well known to us all. It's great, really, really good news. Any questions for Mark or Mark? Yeah, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. Kirsty, thanks. A really good report, and nice to see the focus on people is still moving forward whilst we're in this sort of interregnum until our new people director arrives. But very pleased to see that, and pleased to hear about the attraction and retention work, and that's ongoing on top of the work that you did last year. I just wondered on people whether our survey actions that were communicated to the board several months ago following the survey, just where they've got to, and if we're not, I'm not asking for a response now, but I just wonder whether that could be part of an ongoing piece of work from you. And so if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, so this was in response to the staff survey last year, and we agreed that we would have some key priorities that we would lead as an executive, and I think now we've got Kate and Rosie and Mark here. We probably just need to come back and refresh that one again, just to make sure that we've got the right people leading on the right areas. I know, and then so we had those key priorities, and then sitting underneath that, we challenged each of the individual directorates and the team sitting under them to make sure that they also had their change, that their responses tied up with to it, so it was all neatly aligned. I know certainly from my directorate that's what's happening, and I know from the work across across the organisation that there's quite a lot of work going on at a local level to address that. But I think we can bring back at the next report an update on the sort of the strategic level the work that we've done in terms of response to the staff survey.
Thanks, Kirsty. And I also had some questions about the performance report, which are we going to move to that, Chairman?
Well, that was what Ian was whispering to me, that we sort of passed it by rather quickly. So yes, let's deal with the performance report, Mark.
So I have some questions about it. Firstly, I found the new format really good, and I'm looking forward to getting my training so that I can use it more effectively. I have to say I was slightly challenged by the number of lines and colours, but perhaps I can do something about that myself. But I really had three questions. So, Kirsty, the vacancy factor, which is now a feature in the people and learning piece, or part of that balanced scorecard. I'm just assuming that that number is excluding the transformation resources. Could you just confirm that?
Yes, it is. That's the vacancy factor that the individual directorates have in order to sort of manage their budget. We do look at that across the organisation, and that's part of that work I talked about around putting the resourcing, central resourcing oversight group together to help us manage that vacancy factor to help people come in within their budgets.
And could I say, I think it's great that we've got more people KPIs, and especially with Rena here, I think it's, we have a commitment to the networks and a commitment to deliver on the challenges made to us as an organisation from Klein report. So it's really good to see that we've got a KPI. We don't have a measure for it yet, but we've got the KPI there around our underrepresented groups around recruitment, career and development opportunities. And I think that that's a really positive step forward. So I really thank the executive team for moving that part of the agenda forward. And then if I could just finally ask Chris a question about the finance update, where we note that there's a negative trend at the beginning of the year. And then there's a piece of work that I know you're leading about budget and capital revenue split. What I'm not sure about is whether that's good news or bad news. So could you perhaps comment on that?
Yeah. So we're early into the year, but the trend is showing an adverse position for the year. So we're looking at that across directorates. So that's not a good part. At the same time, we're still assessing the change programme. So there's a piece of work ongoing at the minute around resources for our change programme. And as we're getting the business cases through, it's really starting to define the split between capital and revenue funding, and we're concluding that work at the end of this month. So from that'll give us more clarity on what is our revenue position look like for the year and what is our capital position. So I'll keep board updated on that, but we just need to conclude that bit of work before we have a fuller position. But at the same time, there's discussions at ET around the directorate performance, which we can have anyway.
So, as Mark and Ian pointed out, my enthusiasm to get to the change update, I rather speedily passed by the performance report. So, has anybody got any other questions on performance? Ian?
It's not a question, just picking up on Mark's point, actually, around this. There's a wider problem, I think, across government around this capital revenue split, because I think increasingly organisations like ours are increasingly consuming technology services in particular. As soon as you start buying services from the cloud, that's the latest thing. It's the right thing to be doing operationally, but that's actually a revenue activity, not a capital activity. So in the olden days, you would just buy more servers. Now you buy more service. And I think government agencies in particular, the revenue capital split has just not kept up with the operational reality of cloud services. So I think it's going to be an issue in the next sort of year, 18 months across the whole of government. And the work that Chris is doing is simply part of that.
Lewis.
I feel I should ask about enforcement again, if only for the reasons of tradition. Before I go. As you know, I've put forward the idea that we should have more detailed information about how enforcement proceeds, not just the outcomes, so that we can understand the process. Because we used to have in the previous performance report different ways of reporting on providers who were in breach, how long they'd been in breach, those that were in special measures, and the kind of enforcement action that we'd taken. But those were all separate strands of information, and it was useful. There's no question it was useful, and it reminded us every time we met that there were 400 or 500 organisations in special measures, which was a very important thing for us to be aware of. But what it didn't do was fit together and tell a story about how enforcement was taking place. So how long you might be in breach before you might move into special measures, or before some other action was taken, like provider closed down, or for that matter, improved. And I think there was one occasion where Debbie, who you mentioned earlier, provided as a sort of one-off paper some further detailed information about that issue, about the dynamic nature of enforcement and what the outcomes were. And I suppose in moving to the new model, it would be useful to hang on to that and develop it in that way. The slide we have on enforcement at the moment, I found slightly difficult to know exactly what it meant, because on the face of it, it looked like we were taking less enforcement action during the course of the last year, step by step. And I can't believe that's true, so there must be some other explanation for why we've set it out as monthly figures. I don't mind if you don't explain that right now, but it's just an example of how at face value, the information can look quite superficial, and the detail that lies behind it is probably the thing that we need to know.
Yeah, Ian.
I think you're right. I think the problem with enforcement is I think your desire to understand that the pathway to enforcement is the right one. I'm not sure we've found a way of graphically demonstrating that. I think perhaps we perhaps need to get into some kind of regular deep dive cycle of reporting every quarter, 6 months or something, which may enable that narrative conversation to take place, albeit supported with numbers. But I think we have traditionally, as you've said many times, I think struggled to actually get behind the detail of what otherwise just looks like aggregations of things, and you miss that what's actually really happening, what are the trends, which I think is what we all really want to see. So perhaps I can suggest, Peter, that we take that away and have a think about what a regular deep dive type report would look like to support that ambition.
Good, thank you. Anything else on either the change update or the performance report? Okay, so we'll move on then to market oversight. Welcome to Stuart Dean. Kate, are you going to introduce?
Welcome to this agenda item. Stuart, do you want to come and join the table and just take the seat over there so you can use a mic when you do your slot? Thank you. This agenda item is an opportunity for us to share with the board some key facts about the work of the market oversight team and what they've been doing over the last financial year, but also some reflections of the kind of unique position they have about the work they're doing with providers. So at this point, I'll hand over to Stuart Dean, who's Director of the Market Oversight team, to walk you through your short slide deck.
Thank you very much, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. So if we turn to slide 3, the sort of starting point is just really a sort of reminder of the overarching purpose of market oversight, which, as far as possible, is to minimise the avoidable uncertainty for vulnerable people owing to a disruption to their continuity of care as a result of business failure. And the way that the group does that is by monitoring the financial sustainability of potentially difficult to replace providers. And typically those can be providers as a result of overall size, regional concentration or specialism of provision. The notification criteria for us to advise local authorities of a potential problem is if we satisfy ourselves of likely service cessation as a result of likely business failure. It's a two-pronged notification, and the reason for that is because there's a general acceptance that the market can typically accommodate ongoing small-scale business failure. So that's why it links service cessation as a result of likely business failure. There's no remit within the market oversight powers to prevent failure, and the detail of the guidance and the providers that are captured by the scheme is published on the CQC internet site. So a couple of facts on page 4. There's currently around 60 providers in the scheme. That covers approximately 25% of the care home market in England. The data that we have for home care is rougher and readier, but indicatively it's probably the same percentage coverage. What we've seen in the risk profile since the scheme was launched 4 years ago is an increase in risk, which when we come on the later slides to discuss consolidated data trending isn't a surprise. So if we look at the higher risk classifications in the published operating model, then there has been a 27 percentage point deterioration in that risk profile since launch in April 2015. We've made no further Stage 6 notifications since I last presented in December, so 2 since the scheme was launched, 1 very much a technical notification. As far as I'm concerned, yes, it met the criteria for making a notification, but it was a single home to a single local authority. The one that obviously caught more attention was the corporate-wide notification that we made on allied healthcare later on last year. We do also fall back onto wider CQC powers as and when the need arises to ensure that our objectives and endeavours to discharge the market oversight regulatory responsibilities aren't undermined. I think it's also important to sort of emphasise the unseen influence of market oversight. That is evidenced by way of improved financial discipline, enhanced financial stability, by way of resolving good economic positions, whether that's individual care homes, whether that's larger corporate handbacks. There has been an increasing number of situations where our endeavours have actually resulted in further cash being injected to prop these businesses up, whether that be from private equity, founders, or indeed lenders. I was going to now talk a bit about the latest consolidated data trending, which starts on slide 5. So this captures data predominantly to December 2018. It is predominantly because, unfortunately, the information returns that we have from the providers in the scheme don't nicely land on the same period end. So it's broadly to December 2018, and it covers the like-for-like data analysis for 54 of the 60 providers currently in the scheme. So a meaningful representation, but importantly, on a like-for-like analysis. So as far as possible, we've backed out any influence from acquisitions, providers leaving the scheme, etc. So this trending is as meaningful as we're able to provide from the data set that we receive. So what we're seeing is continued margin erosion. We cannot sort of emphasise enough the higher level of profit pre-rent and so if we're looking at EBITDA margin firstly, this is a high level proxy for profit. So by definition, it's before central overheads, rent, amortisation, depreciation, tax and interest. The reason why it is pegged that high is purely a result of the information that we're provided with by way of the financial templates. Notwithstanding that, it provides us with a directional proxy for not only profit but also what's happening to the underlying businesses. And what we're seeing there is continued margin attrition to the tune of 1% over the 2-year period. I think what's important to see, if you look at the chart on the top right corner on the slide on page 5, is that notwithstanding the increase in turnover per the 2 green columns, which in part is driven by both an increased proportion of private pay but also increased local authority fee increases, those increases have not been able to keep pace with the increased costs that these businesses are facing, and that's predominantly staff costs, both permanent labour costs as well as agency costs. The negative impact on margins is more significant in care home businesses that are predominantly funded by the taxpayer, so the public purse. And in this latest analysis, it's 3 times higher. Occupancy continues to be under pressure during this period, which again is still pegged back to the harsh winter last year, where there was an unprecedented level of deaths in the sector, and it does take time, and these businesses can only recover at a certain rate, assuming that there is the admissions pipeline to actually backfill the vacancies that creates. The other important point, though, that's driving this sort of occupancy pressure is a conscious decision by providers where the depth of the market and the fabric of the environment allows is to divert admissions away from public pay to private pay. And we see that consistently. As I say, where the depth of the market and the fabric of the environment allow. And that is to preserve margin, and again is another effort of the providers to sort of prop up and reduce the extent of the margin attrition that they're seeing in their businesses. What we've also done on slide 6 is really to try and develop our sort of outlook in terms of, given what we know about the sector, as far as possible, what might the sort of outlook be. So we know from sort of the market that there are sustained staff cost pressures, and that those are exceeding local authority fee increases, which would suggest that existing market fragility is unlikely to improve in the short term. Based on realistic cost increases in the next 12 months, so that uses the NMW percentage increase that was sort of in place in
National Living Wage
April, and pension auto enrolment, as well as probably a conservative estimate for continued agency cost increases, as well as the published retail price index increase for the next 12 months. When you roll all of that together, if the providers are likely, so this is a forecast, so there's no certainty, but if they're likely to stand a chance of being able to preserve their existing margins, then that would require a fee uplift of the tune of 5.7%. The feedback from the sector that we're receiving when we're sort of having our engagement meetings is that typically that level of fee increase isn't happening. It's far nearer the 3.5%, and as a result, when you make the same assumptions that I've just countered through, the impact on profit margins there would be a further 1.6 percentage point attrition, so between 1 and 2%. But it remains to be seen, and I would say the key vulnerability to this analysis is what happens to labour costs, both on a permanent and agency basis. I appreciate that was a whistle-stop tour, but are there any questions that people would ask of me? Kirsty.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Stuart, when you're talking about the depth of the market, whether we've done an analysis out on a sort of geographical basis and looking at where we've got the biggest vulnerabilities at a local level.
So because the scheme is, the vast majority of companies captured by the scheme are captured because of their overall size, and the way in which we capture the financial performance is to look at the group level. So what I'm saying is our ability to actually distill the information down onto a regional basis is very limited when we're in an effort to discharge the primary responsibility of the scheme, trying to be proportional and reasonable with the information requests that we're making of the providers. So that is something that's very difficult for us to do. What we do is by working with partner organisations and anecdotal sort of conversations that we're having with providers, and also where a situation allows, perhaps there's been quite public contract handbacks that has happened in certain situations, is to sort of capitalise on that and again bring it in, ensure it's brought into the conversations, both with the department, LGA, ADAS, etc. But we are limited as to the detail of the regional work that we can undertake because, frankly, I don't have that information as a starting platform. Paul?
But given the analysis contained in your slide deck, which is those providers that depend upon local authority paid for as against paid privately are going to have a harder time, then those providers that are within those local authorities will be more at risk than those that are likely to be more at risk than those that have privately paid for. And that would be a north versus south problem.
That's a fair assumption, correct. And what also needs to be borne in mind is that there are two quite opposite factors at play, particularly in the care home market, whereby if one were to look at the net bed movement, then that overlooks the fact that new capacity going into the market is predominantly, if not exclusively, biased towards private pay, whilst the capacity leaving the market is sort of biased towards the public purse, given that there isn't a problem more generally in the private pay market. And again, what this analysis allows is for that then to be backed out to broader sector comparables.
Robert? If one translates that into provision, are you saying that were I the owner of a place, a company that could attract private funders, then I've got a potentially profitable business, but if I'm reliant on publicly funded people, I'm going to go out of business? I mean, not immediately, but in other words, one is more reliant on the sort of funding issues that you have to deal with in market oversight, and therefore is much more vulnerable to disappearance.
Okay, so as a starting point, these businesses are operationally levered. So what that means is that they have high fixed cost bases, and therefore any change, there is a disproportionate impact of a change in turnover in terms of what then flows through to profit. That's whether turnover increases or whether turnover reduces. So if you if you accept that as a starting point and then go to Peter's comment that actually if you're operating in an environment where your turnover is at a lower level because your bed capacity is perhaps directed to the public purse rather than the higher paying private funder, then by definition, because the cost base doesn't change materially between what is required for public provision versus private provision, you're going to be operating on finer margins, and as a result of that, there is the potential for those businesses, the publicly funded biased businesses, to face more financial pressure.
So, Lewis is on my mind. I can't think why today, Lewis. What I was going to say, Stuart, is that right at the start you had a slide that talked about the unseen influence of market oversight, I'm in the sort of privileged position of being able to see that unseen influence, and it's really huge. And it's a great pity that for a whole pile of very sensible reasons it has to be unseen, but it's worth just saying to you and your team that the work you do is really important, and that unseen influence is huge and very valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. Right. So we will move on to the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee annual report. Paul. Microphone.
Thank you, Peter. I notice we've got lots of time for this.
As much as you want.
I'm sure we're excited by that. There's two things here. One is that there's a report of a very short report of the last meeting of the ACGC, which spent quite a lot of time on the year-end matters that we go through, which is around the annual report and accounts, finalisation of that, and the different streams of work which go towards that from both finance but also from internal audit and from the external audit NAO perspective. And all that has been encapsulated as well within the annual report, which is here of the committee. So over the year, one of the factors which has been very much in the spotlight for us has been the change programme, which Kirsty was talking about earlier, and I think the committee were pleased to see the progress that was made over the year in terms of getting greater clarity around where we are in that programme, what's envisaged with it, getting realistic plans in place, and getting greater insight and ability to report progress to both the board and generally. So congratulations to the team on that. I think we've made a lot of progress. We have also made a progress on the change programme itself. The aspects of internal audit, I think we were pleased with the way that the internal audit programme had been executed over the year. I think we get good value from, in terms of I'm not sure talking in monetary terms, but I'm talking about in terms of the output from the internal audit. It is a valuable resource to us. And the overall internal audit report is looking like being one which gives moderate assurance, which actually is a technical term, but it means that's a term which I think is satisfactory from our perspective around that. The individual reports which came through give us some good work, some instances of good work by the CQC, and some areas for improvement. On the whole, the good stuff was outbalanced the needs for improvement around there, which was good. The management, it's management's own processes of assurance, which are really very commendable in the way that they go through this on a thorough basis. Management looking at its own basis for being assured that it has sound controls and sound financial reporting came in with some really good responses on that, they marked on a basis out of 10, and there are some areas which are moving into 10 out of 10 on that, which is really quite encouraging. So some good work in there. We need to keep that up. And then on the audit as a whole and the financial reporting as a whole, we heard a bit earlier about where we are in progress there, and just so we can summarise that, there are one or two areas where we're just finalising one or two bits of the financial reporting with particularly ourselves, and then also getting the NAO through their final processes. But that looks like it's all on track for a clean audit report in due course. So I think with that, I'll stop and invite any questions.
So can I just add, Paul, that I think the work of the subcommittee, the change subcommittee, which I know came in towards the end of the year you're reporting on, I think that's been a really useful addition to the work of your committee. So thank you, and thanks to the people who are giving up a lot of their time to be on that group. Any questions for Paul? So, Lewis, we move to what is your swan song. We've got 3 or 4 hours if you want to.
Just briefly, there are so the RGC Regulatory Governance Committee. 2 things to say. First of all, I'm reporting. This is the annual report of RGC, and also there is the slightly postponed report on the most recent meeting. So just putting them together, 2 points from each. On the annual report, we changed the way RGC worked this year it used to consider regulatory activity in each of the sectors, each of the inspectorates. And we felt that it would make more sense and perhaps be more forward-looking to turn our attention instead to themes that cut across inspectorates. And so we've had 3 meetings that have done that. The first was on learning disability, the second was on dementia, and the third was on inequalities. And I think the benefit of doing that has been that it's a bit more aligned with some of our future work on inspecting multiple providers within a sense of place, that place-based model that people talk about. I think it made more sense. I think it also highlighted that within CQC we weren't always certain where the leadership was coming from in some of these cross-cutting areas. Because many of the inspectorates are doing very good work. I mean, it is sometimes quite incredible how much work is taking place across, say, dementia. But where it was being coordinated and overseen, I think, was less clear at times. And so that was a message, I suppose, back to the organisation. We didn't stop looking at individual areas of inspection, and they're also remarkable in their own way. This year, because of that change towards themes, we've looked at what have ended up being relatively circumscribed parts of the CQC remit, so health and justice and children, where our inspectors work alongside other inspectorates. And it's a relatively, I suppose, unseen, relatively unsung in some ways part of the system, but incredibly important work, working with some very vulnerable people and contributing to these broader multi-agency inspections. And then there was the exposure to medical radiation inspection. So a part of CQC that many of us didn't know existed, but it was fascinating, partly because it had been prompted by a national visit by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so, when you think of the breadth of work sometimes that CQC is engaged in, a visit from the International Atomic Energy Inspectorate, I think, is not something that most people think we do, but there you are. It is fascinating and very important work, because radioactive products are a very important part of medical provision. And yet, who is inspecting them, who is ensuring safety, that comes down to what CQC do. So some very important reporting opportunities and some very important cross-cutting themes. On the specifics of the last meeting, which was a couple of weeks ago, this is where we looked at inequalities as a theme. And I just want to mention, just in summary, the outcome of that. I think there was a recognition that we could be a driver of greater attention to issues of inequality by the questions that we ask providers. And those questions might be about how those providers are meeting their obligations, their equality duties under legislation, or for that matter under existing standards. And I suppose the race equality standard is the most obvious example of that. But there is also a chance for us to say, as an inspectorate, that we want to know how has a provider taken into account the demography of the area in which they're providing care. What are they if they're in an area with quite mixed ethnicity? How does that affect the provision of care in that area? And so the conclusion was that is a role for us, and that is something that we would take further. And then finally, we looked at something which is in the terms of reference of RGC, but isn't always talked about in detail, and that's our whistleblowing responsibility. And in that area, we had one very important conclusion, which was about feeding back to people who report to us under the broad heading of whistleblowing, I think it's fair to say, but people who give us information which is privately presented and reflects their concerns that they then want us to take up in one way or another. And a recognition from CQC that sometimes we don't feed back to them enough what we've done about their concerns and how they've influenced our inspection plans or the questions that we might ask. And so there's a piece of work now going on, which Ursula Gallagher is leading, to do exactly that, to work out how we can be better at responding to people who tell us things that they're concerned about. So that's it.
Thank you, Lewis. Any questions or comments for Lewis? It's a great committee, Lewis. I mean, I go to most of your meetings. I don't get to every single one, but they really are super, and I think made a big contribution to CQC. Takes us to any other business. A matter of profound regret that unusually Bren McInerney is not actually with us today, and it's particularly regretful for two reasons. One, actually, he lives closer to Bristol than he does to London, so I don't know where Bren is. He normally tells me when he's not coming. But secondly, I wanted to be able to say publicly to him in person our congratulations on his British Empire Medal that he was awarded in the Queen's Birthday Honours list. And Bren's been a superb supporter of CQC and the local community, particularly in Gloucester, although he's sort of got national ambitions because, Chris, you and I spent some time with Bren in Coventry, and I don't know where else he's going to go next, but Birmingham. so Bren, if you happen to watch this from the board of the CQC, very many congratulations on your honour, well-deserved honour in the birthday honours. Secondly, Lewis and Paul, it's your last meetings. I mean, as a matter of corporate governance, as a matter of the board as a whole, I think it is absolutely right. There is rotation that 2-3 year terms is probably about the right time. So at a sort of corporate level, it's a good thing, but at a individual personal level, it's a tragedy. I mean, we're going to miss two colleagues. You've both been through what I've referred to as CQC 2.0. So you both came in at the time when CQC was at its lowest level and been a huge part of turning it around and building it into the organisation it is today. And you made a huge contribution. And I think in addition to that, both of you in your different ways have been a huge support to me. I mean, offline, you both said things. Sometimes I haven't always agreed with everything advice you've given me, but seriously, it's been a really, really good, supportive role, and I've valued your counsel, both of you, hugely, and I hope that will continue from wherever you're looking at things that are going on here. I'd be very sad not occasionally to be getting input from both of you. So just on behalf of the board and the whole of CQC, a huge thank you to you both. By the way, you've got 2 more weeks when you're still on the hook as board members, just in case anything else happens, but this will be your last board meeting. So perhaps everybody just join me in just thanking Lewis and Paul. So we have no other business. I'm looking around the board. We did have 3 written questions which were submitted in advance, but they all related to specific issues which have been subject to very extensive correspondence between the complainant and CQC. And really as a result of that, they just weren't appropriate to be taken as a question in the public board. And we also received a 4th question which relates to an individual's care and again for slightly different reasons not appropriate for the discussion in the board. So although we had those 4 questions in advance, in fact there are no questions from the public on this occasion. So that is the end. That is the end of the meeting. Well, could I suggest that we have a conversation with Professor Bates? No. No, I'm sorry.
I've been reassured this morning that you're, really passionate about
No, we are.
So I'm not trying to share my story, and I think it's important the board listen to it.
So no, because it's not. But what I was going to say, and I hope you'll accept this, Professor Baker, because I think this relates to your daughter's treatment in some hospitals. Yeah, no, well, no, so that may well be the case, but I think this needs to be a conversation which we would like to have with you, so we want the information and experience. It's just not in the public board session. So Professor Baker and I would be very happy to... So
simple, basic errors that you're making.
So, no, I'm sorry. No, I would like to sit down with you, and Professor Baker has said he would like to sit down and hear what you have to say. But we're not doing it in a public board meeting because it's just not appropriate to do this in public. I'm really sorry. But I hope you won't rush off. Professor Baker and I have agreed before the meeting we'd like to sit down and talk to you and hear your story. So it's not that it's not important. It's just the forum in which we have it, and it really is not appropriate in a public session. So that is the end of the meeting, but please don't rush off. We want to hear your story. Thanks, everybody else. We will resume with our board seminar after lunch.